Hi everyone, and welcome to the latest Sibylline Insight podcast, where today we're going to be talking through the unfolding situation in Cuba. As ever, before we start, if you never want to miss an episode, please do sign up to our mailing list. The links are in the show notes below. My name is Galvin. I'm the lead Americas Analyst here at Sibylline, and I'm joined by our Latin America and Caribbean Intelligence Analyst Inigo Camilleri and our North America Analyst Azul Hidalgo Solá. We're your panel today to discuss, as mentioned, the situation unfolding in Cuba. So to start, let's begin with a little bit of context. So Azul, could you please talk us through where we are in terms of US foreign policy and why this situation is really emerging as a talking point at the moment?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Lewis. So basically, since January of this year, the Trump administration has increased pressures on Cuba through a series of measures, whether that is through kind of assertive rhetoric coming from Secretary of State Marco Rubio or President Donald Trump kind of calling Cuban President Díaz-Canel as illegitimate, kind of discussing a friendly or unfriendly takeover of the country. That coupled with kind of U.S. tariff threats on Mexico based on kind of oil shipments to the island, and kind of pressure on partner countries to reduce or end existing initiatives such as the doctor exchange programs, right? And so kind of all of these things that are funding the Cuban regime are kind of pressure points to draw the Cuban regime to negotiate with the Trump administration. And the reason why kind of we're seeing this emerging as a priority for the Trump administration, I think, is threefold. I think it exists within these 3 points. And so one of them being kind of Russian and Chinese influence in the US, in the sphere of influence. We can see this trajectory coming from the administration a couple of months back with the Greenland discussion on similar kind of concerns over security. There's also kind of the opportunity factor here that, you know, it's coming out of the Venezuela, which kind of the operation there that the administration regards as a success, as well as kind of garnering support from the Latin communities, both in the United States, but also in the region overall. And I think also we can't underestimate the fact that this is largely supported and spearheaded by Marco Rubio, who has a personal connection to the issue and seeing it through within this administration. And I think kind of one last thing to tag on to there is, you know, the U.S. midterm elections coming up in November and kind of the necessity for the government to garner this kind of Cuban diaspora support, especially in southern Florida.
Absolutely, and I think you're right to mention that there are multiple drivers, I think, behind the situation in Cuba and the question of why now. Of course, many of these drivers have been prominent in our recent podcasts. So when we talked about Venezuela, when we talked about Greenland as well, a couple of these thematics were cropping up. But of course, Cuba is not Venezuela. Cuba is not Greenland. Cuba is Cuba. So Inigo, in light of this US pressure, could you please just talk us through a little bit about what the state of play currently is in Cuba amid this US campaign?
Yes, of course, Lewis. Thank you. Right. So the main thing in Cuba is that prior to Maduro's arrest by the US, Cuba obtained approximately 60% of its oil from Venezuela. And after his arrest, the oil flow was halted. Now, Cuba produces 40% of the oil it consumes and needs. The main issue is that's insufficient to run the electricity grid, which already suffers from maintenance issues. And that's insufficient, for example, to run any public transport system or hospitals, or apart from obviously any essential or urgent measures. The main issue with this is that the fuels being stopped has caused quite significant food shortages, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas like the capital, Habana. But most importantly, it's also halted public transport. So it's essentially isolated a lot of communities, especially in rural areas, which in turn has also produced a shortage of medical supplies and essential needs. Although, for example, recently we saw reports being denied by public hospitals in Cuba of shortages of ventilators and other materials. There are ongoing shortages, and for example, reports a couple of weeks ago pointed to the fact that non-essential procedures were being completely suspended indefinitely. I believe it was, Lewis, correct me if I'm wrong, but in February, Cuba issued a notice to airmen. It was in February, right? Yes. They issued it initially for a month, and they justified it due to a shortage of A1 fuel. Essentially, all major airports in Cuba are halted or mostly halted. Airlines have stopped flying or reduced most of their flights. And the NOTAM was actually extended in March until, I believe, the 11th of April. So unless we see a significant resumption of oil flow, for example, I think it's likely to expect that the NOTAM is going to be extended again. And obviously, the whole situation with a lack of tourism arriving, given that it's a key part of the economy, a lack of public transport, food, and medical supplies have pushed protests and demonstrators to actually go out on the streets and attempt to pressure the authorities. However, Cuban protests tend to be quite fragmented and isolated. The authorities tend to not just crack down on protesters, but identify drivers and the motivators of them, and essentially suppress any unrest before it becomes too large. So that's the main scenario going on in Cuba right now.
Thanks, Inigo. So indeed, it sounds like this US pressure campaign and the fuel shortages are really impacting broad swathes of Cuba's society. I mean, you mentioned there medical shortages, we're talking food shortages, issues with water supplies as well. And of course, impacts on the tourism industry. So really, implications for a lot of the pressure points in Cuba and areas which the Cuban regime is really reliant on to keep the country operational. So now that we're seeing these real returns of the US's campaign, and now we're seeing the real implications. The next question is, what is the US seeking to gain from this? So I know there are a couple of different talking points that often make it out into the media, but perhaps let's start with one of the more alarming prospects potentially that the US could be seeking to achieve here in Cuba. So Azul, regime change. Is that something that is on the cards? Is that something that the US is thinking about? And if so, what could that potentially look like?
Yeah, that is certainly kind of the big, hot topic right now when it comes to US-Cuba relations. And so, as I mentioned before, kind of Trump's rhetoric on this topic has fluctuated from kind of wanting a friendly to an unfriendly takeover of the island, and then calling Diaz-Canel illegitimate. So while this has been the rhetoric kind of in the media, the administration has continued to negotiate with influential Cuban policymakers who kind of share the regime's ideological alignment, right? But the administration sees them as perhaps more progressive and able to malleable to accepting kind of US demands, especially kind of in the economic sphere of things. And so this can be seen through the administration's talks with the security official Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, which is the grandson of former President Raul Castro, so very much part of the establishment that is already there. But our assessment is that in the coming weeks and months, there's a realistic possibility that, faced with these US pressures, the Cuban regime will opt to remove Diaz-Canel, or Diaz-Canel will opt to kind of volunteer to step down despite having 2 more years left in his term. And so kind of while this doesn't really lead to true regime change, because of this presence of high-ranking PCC officials and the Castro legacy continuing, it is kind of a step towards getting a little bit more concessions that the US is looking for. And I think, it's also important to add here, we hear some alarmist things perhaps in the media about kind of a US military operation to kind of topple the regime in Cuba. And to us, that remains a very remote possibility, especially considering kind of the humanitarian situation in Cuba that makes them kind of more malleable to negotiating, as well as kind of overall US domestic policy and sentiment towards the possible ripple effects of the crisis in the Caribbean, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that diaspora impact and influence on US domestic politics is a really important consideration here. And I think, comparative to perhaps other endeavors that the US is undertaking around the world, of course, Cuba is a lot closer to home. So yeah, of course, fully agree with that assessment on the prospect of of military action. Now, Inigo, Azul has just mentioned there that we could possibly see Miguel Diaz-Canel move away or step down, probably peacefully, likely in cooperation with the regime. Is that palatable to Cuba? Is that something that they would consider, or is this completely off the cards and just perhaps a US pipe dream, essentially?
At the minute, we find it unlikely that the US is going to forcibly move out of power either Diaz-Canel or the Cuban government itself, or the Cuban Communist Party even. As Azul said and you said, it's quite an entrenched system, and it's built precisely so that the high-ranking leader, in this case Diaz-Canel, does not hold ultimate executive power to actually take a lot of the decisions. For example, as Azul said, Raúl Castro is a key figure in the regime, and if there was a removal, perhaps a higher possibility could be Diaz-Canel, as you said, stepping down in exchange for perhaps a leader which is more pragmatic or more open, maybe in favor of opening businesses in the US or to the US. However, I did want to say that at the moment, as Azul said, it's a remote possibility. We need to see a series of indicators and steps before that happens. And at the moment, the steps we're seeing is that Cuba's already signaled that it's willing to open certain sectors to US businesses. Key sectors in Cuba include, for example, tourism, as we said before. They also include the tobacco industry is extremely large. And there is also quite key notable trading partners, for example, in Europe. It's not just China. However, we've only seen the initial steps of those concessions. So given that we've already seen them, we expect them to be continued. I believe, Azul, if you can confirm, we can expect also to see the US sustaining that aggressive rhetoric, right?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, so I believe that while that rhetoric will be sustained at the moment, we expect Cuba to continue to provide these business concessions and essentially prioritize any business in the US as a key trading partner and increase the role. We don't think that, for example, the long-term embargo that's been issued on Cuba will be all of a sudden lifted if these concessions are granted, but it will certainly mean a step forward in some sort of agreement or trade agreement. And as for the remote possibility on the military scenario and US military action, we have seen signals again by the US, by the Cuban regime, that they have to take the necessary measures to protect themselves. And they also are sustaining a rhetoric of the Cuban Revolution and, against imperialism. Again, we haven't actually seen any significant movements, and the Cuban government at the minute has bigger problems to face, mainly the aforementioned food shortages and energy and blackouts. So at the moment, yes, it's a remote possibility.
Of course, and I think the fact that the Cuban regime does keep referring to, of course, this idea of the revolution and citing sovereignty, I think is leading us to that assessment that Diaz-Canel, there is a possibility in the medium to longer term that he could peacefully step aside, but we don't expect that to be kind of imminent because, of course, Cuba isn't going to want to look to be giving up or reneging on its ideology immediately just under US pressure. Now, I think whilst that's the sort of regime change element broadly covered, Inigo, you mentioned about how Diaz-Canel could potentially step back in exchange for concessions. So my understanding is we're talking largely economics here, and that is, the low-hanging fruit in where Cuba really needs help and where the US can issue support. So I'm keen to know, though, from the US's perspective, what could be considered acceptable? What kind of areas are they going to look for and pressure Havana to make those economic concessions?
Definitely, as you mentioned, it is kind of the lowest hanging fruit and what we see kind of happening in the near term in terms of concessions from the Cuban regime, and also a measure that might appease the Cuban diaspora at home as well, right? Which is something that the Trump administration is very in tune with. And so kind of the types of concessions that we see as a possibility that, the Cuba is actually able to offer and that would satisfy U.S. demands would include kind of facilitating FDI, privatization of key economic sectors. So that includes, the extractive sector, tourism, agricultural industries, especially when it comes to tobacco, kind of the issuance of licenses for U.S. firms that want to invest in those sectors, and kind of more protections, assurances that, this is a long-term investment that will reap benefit for U.S. firms. And then, specifically seeking the support of this Cuban diaspora that we keep mentioning. It's kind of the way to get to that group would be to increase the cap on quarterly remittances, right? And so allowing the ability for the diaspora to invest and send humanitarian aid directly, not through the Cuban regime, to the people that need it within the island, which, I know we keep on underscoring the importance of this diaspora, but it is kind of an election year, and Florida has a lot of seats up for election. And so this is something that kind of appease these voter groups without necessarily propelling a regime change.
Absolutely, and I think you're totally right to keep going back to the diaspora as well. I think it's so important, and perhaps even now a little bit understated in the media reporting, because those things like military action and regime change usually are kind of the big headlines, but there are so many underpinning factors here in the US's thinking, and perhaps also a driver of why they are looking at these back channel negotiations, and we're still not really talking about the military prospects, because of course how that would go down back at home, and especially in Florida. Now, Inigo, just very quickly on that. So far, it looks like the Cuban regime has been quite reactionary to the US's pressure. Do we see Cuba opening up a little bit economically, substantially economically, or somewhere in between?
I think we definitely will see Cuba open up. I think the right question is to what extent. I think the current pressure that the US is applying on Cuba is low effort, high reward. They are really pressuring the regime with barely any effort apart from pressuring all the regional allies to cut any ductless programs, to halt any oil supplies. So I feel like the US can sustain this for a long time and Cuba can't. I think the longer we wait, the bigger the concessions will be. I think what we will start to see is Cuba being active instead of reactive. Cuba actually trying to anticipate any US pressure and in some sense be more friendly to avoid any sort of threat. Or for example, one of the indicators that we had for any military action was the threats increasing in frequency and severity. So I think that's one of the main things that Cuba might want to avoid. So yes, I think the reforms will be economic, but they will be more substantial as time passes. However, again, I think this won't be resolved in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. I think this is more in the medium term or even in the longer term. It depends obviously on other issues. So I think economic concessions from Cuba will drip, if that makes sense. They will slowly come forward, and especially amidst, I'm expecting some sort of opposition from inside the actual Cuban regime. After all, it's a military government or structure in which a lot of generals or high-ranking members have actually a lot of power and also economic power on certain industries, which they will not be keen to let go of, right? So I think that's the main driver behind why Cuban concessions will take a long time to come forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree. I think, going back to Cuba probably is not wanting to give up everything on day one in the name of its sovereignty and, in support of its ideology. So I fully agree that I think these are going to be, step by step is how this situation is going to unfold, rather than just a complete, economic reform, perhaps in the immediate term. And of course, we're entering a really critical window here with the situation in the Iran conflict, where the US is heavily involved, and then the midterms towards the end of the year. So, yeah, something that we're looking at really closely, isn't it? Is how these things are unfolding in terms of, or with regards to those timelines. So I think the last couple of points that we can tap into, and we can probably keep this quite top level, I think, because the US is yet to really dig into this issue with Cuba. Elsewhere around the region, the United States is constantly referencing malign influence. We take that as being largely Chinese and Russian influence. In Venezuela, we also had Iran, but perhaps that ship has sailed, so to speak. So Chinese and Russian influence in the region. Cuba is another ally of these countries. Is that going to be a friction point? Inigo, I suppose we can go to you. What is Cuba likely thinking when looking at Russia and China in amongst all of this?
Yes, I mean, I think it's a very good question, and it's also interesting to hear after what Azul has to say from the US side of things. However, yes, Cuba has historically maintained SIGINT stations in the island, so has China, or radar stations justified through scientific research, I believe. However, they openly admit to cooperating, and of course, in the Cold War, Russia or the Soviet Union was an ally or the main supporter of Cuba, right? So there are obviously historical links. However, we recently saw that Russia has upped its rhetoric against the US in terms of Cuba, defending its independence and its right to defend itself. However, they also announced they would send measures to mitigate all the oil shortages. And the tanker that was sent was redirected to Trinidad and Tobago, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that's a clear sign that Cuba and China's support largely at this moment is symbolic and will remain symbolic, mainly because the significance of Cuba, the historical significance also of being in proximity, right, either by the US or close to the US, has lost somewhat importance, right? Anyone can pretty much get anywhere at this point. So I believe that those two issues will remain geopolitical and symbolic. I think they will escalate in words, perhaps in the UN or accusations, but I don't expect, at least in the short term, to see any significant support by China or Russia to defend Cuba in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue into that last point there, that we're going to very quickly touch on, and that is anyone coming to Cuba's rescue? At this point, of course, Russia and China are the parties that we're really talking about here as allies, and I think you've already set the scene. It doesn't look likely that these states are coming to Cuba's aid. I think it was 2 tankers we've actually seen technically coming out of Russia that were destined for Cuba. One of them has indeed been redirected to Trinidad. I suspect that ties into larger US foreign policy goals elsewhere around the globe. Of course, Russia currently getting some sanctions relief on its oil, which notably excludes Cuba. So Cuba will not be getting or benefiting from that relief. And of course, we've already seen the US interdicting oil vessels and sanctioned vessels over the last couple of months in and around the Venezuela situation. So I suspect that's probably feeding into the Russian thinking. And of course, China has remained largely quite quiet, other than reaffirming Cuba's right to defend itself. So I'm in full agreement. It doesn't look like either of these states are coming to Cuba's aid. And that just circles us back nicely to why we think, these discussions are going to go ahead with the US and why some potential economic opening up is going to happen, because ultimately, I don't think Cuba is really left with an awful lot of choice at this point. I think that's a great place to end, if you folks agree. I think that was a really good discussion on a really interesting topic, and something that I think is going to become, it's something we look at on a daily basis. But I think, as potential conflict subsides elsewhere, a lot more people are going to hear a lot more about the unfolding situation in Cuba. So thank you very much, Azul and Inigo, for joining me for this chat today. And as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, to our listeners, if you never want to miss an episode, and I'm sure you don't want to miss an episode, of course, please do sign up to our mailing list. The links can be found in the show notes below. Otherwise, please subscribe, please leave a review, and we can't wait to see you next time. Thank you.